a lockdown. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a panel of 3 guests from across Make UK, whose expertise covers a few areas really today. On hand to offer some practical advice and guidance and practical considerations for businesses who are perhaps looking to restore some sense of their operations. So I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Nicola Kibble, who's head of HR and legal commercial services. I'm joined by Ian Hunter, who's a national lead, considerable time and have vast experience of advising manufacturing fields. Before I hand you over to Nicola, just a reminder of some of our policy level activities. We're currently working with government with a few key aims on behalf of our members. We're working to ensure the quickest possible return to normal trading conditions. Your regional membership team for more information there. Nicola.
Thank you, Roger. As part of your, it would be quite unusual for organisations to return to business as usual. Give yourselves and your senior management team time to focus on what your objectives look like for the short, mid and long term. Schedule a strategy meeting. Reviewing your objectives will help you decide whether to diversify your product range, your markets, or if you even require a different workforce structure. Also, consider the knock-on effect both up and down the supply chain. Once you have identified you require a change in how you operate, you need to create a change management program with clearly defined timelines, a communication strategy, and points in order to review these. Understand how this program will benefit you and be open to challenge or suggestions from your workforce. They may well understand or be aware of some things that would or wouldn't work better for you. And the third point on the HR strategy. Understand what your response was to COVID-19. Did you have an existing contingency plan? And if so, what worked well and what didn't work? What lessons can you learn from this? Also consider if you need to write one or rewrite your contingency plan. Has your view on which roles are essential to the business changed? What happens if we have a second reoccurrence? Are you prepared? You may notice just at the point you need to pull everyone together, employees are backing off and feeling a bit nervous. Undertake an employee survey to understand their concerns and look for any quick fixes. For example, parents who have children away from school may need to work from home a bit longer. Can you accommodate this or find any workarounds? What about if employees are nervous around social distancing? Can you communicate your plans in relation to the workspace and the use of PPE? And then finally, whistleblowing. Whistleblowing should be viewed as a way you can improve your business processes and actions. You should investigate and understand the whistleblowing allegation. Did you do something wrong? Can you fix it? What are the risks associated with the allegation? Would it be reputation, financial, employee welfare? Do you need to change the way you operate in light of the allegations? And do you have sufficient resources to investigate the allegations properly and make suitable recommendations? Moving on to restructure of the workforce. In order to look at the structure of your workforce, you need to consider, what does your order book look like? Do you think that this is a short-term issue? If so, can you consider short-term working by using temporary layoff clauses in your contracts? If this is a longer-term issue, then do you need to consider redundancies? Do remember there is a financial cost to the redundancy process, and also you may lose skills that you will later need. We will be running a webinar on the impact of coronavirus and the redundancy process. This will cover the following areas. Can you collectively consult with employees whilst they're on furlough? How do you consult with employees and representatives who are furloughed? What is a special circumstances defence? How do you calculate redundancy pay for furloughed employees? Is it unfair to dismiss for redundancy purposes if furlough is still available? Please continue to check the website for dates of this course. Following your strategy review, did you identify a different way of working or product line? And does your workforce have the skills to adapt? Can you skill or train them? Do you need to recruit new skills into the business? If so, is your recruitment process robust enough to ensure you select the best candidate within a tight time frame? You may have also identified that you need to change the way you operate, either moving to or from 24/7 hour operations. Have you considered changing your shift patterns or introducing annualized hours to flex with demand? Okay, and what about employees returning to work? In order to protect your returning workforce, you should consider undertaking a screening review with all employees, and this should happen prior to their return. Also, remember, you may wish to undertake a return to work interview with all employees to welcome them back and discuss any concerns they may have. For some businesses, demand increased and resulted in fast recruitment. You may wish to place these recruits through an induction process on your company processes and policies that was missed due to the high operational demand when they joined. Also remember, it is vital that you check their right to work documentation such as passports and work visas. Some employees may request to continue working from home either temporarily or permanently, and you should consider if this is something that the business can accommodate. What would be your rationale for refusing these requests if employees have been doing this effectively for several weeks? Or conversely, is this something you will be asking employees to do more of in the future to save on associated costs with rent and building facilities? Okay, we'll move on to legal compliance. And it's important for me to say, before you undertake any changes to contracts, benefits, or employee status, please take advice from your Make UK advisor or the National Advice Line. Whilst it may be possible to do all of these things to save money, it is important you follow a correct process and are very clear on why you need to make the changes and how much money your business will save prior to starting the process. Consultation is always the fairest process. Making unilateral changes has a risk of employees claiming unlawful deduction of wages and/or constructive dismissal. Consider if any proposed changes impact employees with protected characteristics. Consider if you could offer the same level of benefits, perhaps using a different supplier. Training and development. You may have identified as part of your strategic plan that you need to upskill or reskill your workforce. Undertake a training needs analysis, especially if you're looking to diversify or change your working practices. Potentially, you could reduce your overall headcount and have a multi-skilled workforce, but your employees may expect a higher rate of pay for being multi-skilled. Make sure your line managers are sufficiently trained so they are confident to deal with any change programs, difficult conversations, the consultation process, and managing underperformance. This would also be a good opportunity to look at building employee resilience in the workplace, how they manage their time, and how they work efficiently and effectively. When creating your succession plan, consider the gaps so that you have sufficient time to build them into the plan. Thanks, Roger. Back over to you.
Thanks, Nicola. Okay, Ian, you should be able to pick up the presentation from here and have control of the screen.
Thank you, Roger. Welcome, everybody. None of us, I think, can escape the damaging and tragic consequences that COVID-19 has brought to the workplace, and we have over 3 million globally recorded cases now to deal with, and the effect of that is shocking, I think, for everybody, and none more so than the health and safety professional. And we're working through seismic changes in the way health and safety works in the workplace, and as we're all aware, business has responded in the early phases of this by stopping production, asking people to work at home, introducing the concept of furlough, which was new to most of us probably when the virus first arrived. We're now moving towards the recovery phase here, where we're thinking about bringing people back to work. So I want to think about 4 key areas that we can provide advice on around this, amongst many. And just to give you an insight as to what we will be talking about over the next few minutes, the 4 areas here. Firstly, risk assessment, and how do we think about risk in the recovery phase of the process. Statutory inspection and getting ready to bring people back into work. Some environmental questions around managing waste and waste streams, and also our environmental permits. And then finally, looking forward a little bit towards planning for the future. How do we plan for pandemics should another one arise, or should indeed this COVID-19 pandemic actually return? So firstly on that, if I can just think about risk assessment here. Whilst it will be difficult for me to claim that the risks posed by the virus are conventional or similar to other workplace risks, because they're not, they're very different, they are novel, I think we should be thinking about COVID-19 in the same way as we think about other workplace risks, and we should use the same tools and techniques that we use to manage other workplace risks, and the starting point for that is risk assessment. Risk assessment helps us to understand our statutory obligations to our employees and to other people who are affected by our work, and indeed it helps us to define our duty of care to our employees where foreseeable risks exist. So we should be, and I'm sure we did in the onset of the virus, think about the way of assessing risks posed by that. But as recovery proceeds, we have a new set of risks to deal with, and I think we're going to need to think about doing a new set of risk assessments to think about specifically the risk factors associated with recovery. We've got quite a lot of information from government and from the regulator, guidance about what to do, and we've understood in great detail to some extent how to implement social isolation at work, for example, so separation of people. But there's a degree of ambiguity around some of those control areas. Face masks is one. The use of screening or temperature checking when people come to work is another one. So it's quite a complex picture. And in and amongst all of that, we do have the concern that this is a people problem. We are working with people, and almost never before has there been more need for good, solid communication, consultation with the workforce, and of course in this environment, compassion for all those people that are coming back to work, many of whom will have been affected in a traumatic way by the effects of the virus and the emergency that it's created. So part of our approach to thinking about risk should be about the well-being of our staff, their mental health, and how we can support that going forward. So we've worked on this here, and we've developed a range of statutory issues that we should think about, organisational concerns and issues related to people themselves. And we've got over 20 areas, all of which are quite complex on their own, that we would want to be thinking about in the risk assessment process. And just to give you a flavour of those, how do we get people back into work? Literally, how do we bring crowds of people back into the workplace and maintain separation? Where do people go? Where do they move about in our workplace during the day? How do we deal with training before people get back to work, and communication about what they need to do when they get back to the business? And indeed, we have external groups of people to think about too, contractors particularly being one, and some businesses very dependent upon contractors will need to think very carefully about how they deal with the contractor population as work resumes. The second area I'd like to think about is statutory inspection for recovery. We're all aware, I think, that plants and buildings are not happy in out-of-service situations, or when they're not being used. Planned maintenance and other activities around keeping plant fit for purpose tend to stop or not be done so often. So we need to think about how to bring equipment back into service safely how to bring buildings back into service safely. And that's really underpinned by little change really in the way the regulator is looking at this area, particularly statutory examinations. Whilst they have made the statement about pragmatic and proportionate, they've also made the statement that equipment and plant must be safe, so that the duty remains with the employer to ensure that plant is safe before it's reinstated, and that does mean taking great care over checking that it's fit for purpose. And in addition to the statutory part of this, we also have a whole range of advisory inspections and assessments to be made around buildings and facilities particularly. Again, we've looked at this in some detail. Over 30 areas of statutory and advisory inspection, we think, that should be carried out before people return to work en masse. And this is going to create quite an overhead for organisations, engineering departments and facilities teams who will need to be thinking about getting buildings and equipment ready for work when the process resumes. Some of those on our checklist here are probably the obvious ones: fire safety particularly, chemical storage, both in warehouse storage settings, but also in tank farms and that kind of storage area. Legionella control, particularly in buildings. But there are others, for example, work at height, platforms, ladders should be inspected before use. What about security arrangements? Are our security fixtures still working? Are they still serviceable? Are security arrangements still in place, or have they deteriorated during the shutdown? So again, we'll be including these in our checklist that Nicola mentioned or referred to a few moments ago. Just thinking here about one or two of the environmental considerations, two thinkings here, one around waste streams and the second around environmental permits. We should be thinking about waste where we can see that the nature of the waste stream has changed. And I think it's quite likely that the makeup of the waste stream will have changed during the startup. It's quite likely that the composition of the waste stream will be different as well, and that's particularly important where we have the potential for infected waste or contaminated waste to suddenly be present in that waste stream. For example, disposal of PPE and other types of waste that might be contaminated. So very important to think about that, and very important also to make sure that our waste carriers are properly licensed to carry the types of waste that we're now producing in the new environment, and also that they're disposing of those wastes appropriately as well. And then the second consideration here is environmental permits. We're probably mostly aware that many organisations create emissions in their manufacturing process, and those emissions are regulated by permits often issued by, for example, the local authority or the Environment Agency. And in this case, again, as we start plant up, notoriously in these situations after long shutdowns, emissions breaches occur because unexpected emissions take place when plant is initially brought back into service. So a lot of work, I think, required around that to understand where these emissions could occur, what precautions can we take to make sure those emissions don't happen. But also we need to think about whether or not our permit actually covers this situation of unexpected emissions. And if we're uncertain about that, our recommendation would be to speak with your regulator to get their advice, discuss it with them, and to see what they recommend for your startup arrangements. So again, before people get back to work, before processes start, there's quite a bit of planning here to make sure that we can comply with permit requirements. The final thing I wanted to talk about here is looking forward a little bit, calling this pandemic planning. I think it's an important area, and scientific intelligence that we're reading is saying to us that the COVID-19 threat is probably or quite likely a cyclical threat. That means that we may see a resurgence of the virus in the future, and that will be particularly threatening to us if we haven't yet found an antibody solution for that, a vaccine that could control the virus. We will need to be thinking about how we respond again in a second in a second scenario. We know that from our learning in this situation, that the issues that the virus has created were more than likely not considered in our pre-COVID crisis management plans. We hadn't planned for this particularly well, I think, and it probably wasn't even mentioned in many crisis management plans. And for the future, most of us, I think, in manufacturing will be looking to sustain our operations if a recurrent phase of the virus happens. And the question for us is, how can this be done? It's a learning process, and learning from what we've encountered and experienced in this initial phase. So we're really strongly recommending here that time is taken to plan ahead here, understand the nature of this first round of infection, and to understand and work out what we can do to mitigate that should a recurrent phase occur in the future. And that could easily happen again this year or very early in 2021, without doubt. The sorts of things that we're thinking about here are understanding properly the risks and impacts, learning from this current phase, the risks and impacts that the virus has created, making sure we have a competent organisation. So are our teams and our management structures in place that would help us deal with this? Do we have a lead manager, for example, who can authorise and take control of actions to manage the risk? How do we prevent infection in the future going forwards? If we revert to the pre-COVID ways of working, that's probably a high-risk situation to be in after this first phase has declined. So we need to be maintaining and sustaining the controls that we put in place in this first phase. What about the high risk and the vulnerable in our teams and externally, the people we work with? And finally, leading into the business continuity area, what about our supply chain? What are the implications for supplies of materials? What does it mean for our customers, distribution chains, storage, all those areas? So a very important area, I think. It would be a big mistake, I think, not to think about how we would deal with a second pandemic phase should it occur. So that's me. Thank you.
Hello, it's Patrick Lee here from the Manufacturing Growth Team. Following on from Ian's observations about the risks that we face going forward, my focus is on the production and operations environment and the activities that we need to consider through the recovery phase. I've just noticed the total of my slides says post-COVID-19, but that's a long way off. This is more focused on how we work and operate with COVID-19 until vaccinations carried out throughout the country, because it is something we're going to have to face for at least 6, possibly 12 months, maybe 18 months. We are going to have to live and operate with the threat of COVID-19 infection. I've got 4 areas to look at: process and production considerations, excuse me, how we prepare to be resilient and sustain operations, supply chain considerations, because we are all part of supply chains. Often when we refer to supply chains, we think of our suppliers, but we have customers. All organisations have customers as well, and there's massive impacts in manufacturing because of disruption in supply chains. Many companies in the initial phases of COVID-19 were forced to close because of the lack of supply of key materials and components. So we have to reevaluate the landscape that we're going to operate in. The third area is business continuity, and that links with what Ian was saying about pandemic planning, how we can prepare for a cyclical lockdown potentially, and the impacts of the virus on staff and their households and the actions that they'll have to take And the fourth area is the potential for diversification and the need for strategic planning. So, process production considerations as operations continue or return or resume. Everyone is going to have to review their full layout and process to support staff separation. It's known that we have to keep people at least 2 meters apart to prevent the spread of infection. So that is going to have a massive impact on all operations, both direct shop floor and indirect working activities. So companies have to consider everything that they do, how they do it, how they're going to operate going forward. As Nicola said earlier on, whether it's changing shift patterns, opening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to accommodate more staff in the working environment, whatever changes are required, there's going to be a significant amount of work required to plan that activity. There's requirements for operating procedures to be documented. It's always the case that the procedures should be documented and recorded and standardised, but weaknesses are being highlighted in those organisations that don't have good documented standard operating procedures, and it particularly impacts when staff are absent or organisations have to reduce the number of staff where they're reliant on the knowledge and experience of staff to be able to complete their tasks and activities. It becomes blatantly apparent when those staff are unable to work. So again, another big piece of work for companies to identify any single points of failure within their organisation where they are reliant on staff knowledge. Changes in process to respond to fluctuations in demand profile. One organisation particularly that had to close the doors basically because lack of material availability. Other organisations that I've been in touch with having to adapt their processes just to be able to respond to when material is available or when organisations are open for business. And that's going to have a massive impact on companies understanding where they are and what they need to do to be able to sustain operations. Customer demand is also fluctuating. There's been a global shift in demand for various products and services. And some will come back on very quickly, others will be protracted in resuming, if they ever do resume, previous demand profiles. So we have to be capable of adapting our processes so that when there is demand, we can switch things on and operate effectively. We also need to be mindful of new products and services that we can conduct, looking at other sectors, other markets where we can provide product services. So we may have to adapt and change current activities to be able to support that to maintain the businesses going forward. Second area I've got is supply chain. We've got to reevaluate now what the current position is for our own material suppliers, component suppliers, and also our position, our relationships with our customers and where we sit within their supply chains. The global shift has occurred. Many organisations are now looking at onshoring supply of components and materials, whereas previously they were importing from overseas. So there will be a period of years now where supply chains shift and move around, which does open opportunities for some, it also will pose challenges for others. We've got to be able to plan and implement whatever measures we need to mitigate those risks that we identify within our supply chain, be able to manage cash and not overstock certain materials, understand where we can source components, materials, and indeed services, because it's supply chains, not just the things that we buy, the materials that we buy, the components. We also need services, we need engineering support, we need machines that need servicing, utilities, everything. Anyone that comes into an organisation to support its operation, we have to be very mindful. They're going to be impacted over the next year or so. So we have to build some form of resilience and look to where we can source those key materials, components, and services. Business continuity sort of follows on from what Ian was saying about pandemic planning. There is a 5-step model for business continuity considerations. First stage, the starting point, is the identification of risk, doing risk assessments, considering COVID-19 as a risk, considering the impact of not only our staff being absent, but the impact on their family circumstances and things like that will have, because if a member of a household has symptoms in the future, we know that the whole household will have to be isolated, which is going to have a knock-on effect to staff availability, so we have to plan for that. Once we've identified the risks, look at what the impact is on the organisation, potentially, decide what our plan of attack is going to be, how we're going to deal with it, and then execute a plan so that we can mitigate risk as much as possible. And quite often a failing within continuity plans is training and testing to ensure that they do function. I know we've had significant tests recently. Lots of organisations that have had continuity plans have realised that they weren't necessarily as robust as needed. In fact, most organisations don't consider pandemics as being a likely threat, although they are a threat. But those considerations will have now changed. So everybody, even if they did have a good business continuity plan, will be re-evaluating that and re-evaluating the actions that they've taken, learning a lot from what's happened over the past 6 or so weeks. And the key is to actually learn from what's happened and put the right things in to the right degree to sustain production going forward. The fourth area, diversification and strategy considerations, that Nicola mentioned right at the very beginning of this webinar. You need to take time to re-evaluate your organisation, where it sits, whether its strategy is still valid going forward, what you need to change, where you need to adapt. There are going to be opportunities for some organisations as a result of what's happened across the world. Those that are quick and responsive will do very well. There'll also be some casualties as a result of what's happened, which may open up opportunities for other organisations as well. So everybody needs to re-evaluate where the landscape is as best they can, and also keep a very close eye on the landscape as it changes, as different countries open their doors and resume operations. There will be a very fluid situation over the coming sort of 6 to 12 months. So people need to be as aware as they can be as to what's going on. Traditional priorities, I often talk about quality, cost and delivery, the trade-off between those three. The focus has been very much rebalanced. The delivery performance was always, or has traditionally been less of a driver for businesses, and they focus on the quality and the cost aspects of the business. But now there's been a complete shift in priority, with many organisations suffering as a result of lack of delivery or inability to deliver product. So in that changing landscape, we need to understand where we are, what our plans are, what the strategy is, and how we're going to plan for the new future. Hopefully these will give you things to think about going forward. As Nicola and Ian have said, there will be a checklist that accompanies the webinar to help you start to tick off the considerations that you have to make as you resume operations and then start planning for the future. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Pat. Much appreciated. Thanks again to all our presenters today, Nicola, Ian, and Pat. The contact details are up on the screen for you, should you want to get in directly into contact with either of our guys, really. Okay, just a few notes. Also, I'd like to just, at this point, just to add on something about our Advantages partners. And finally, we've been talking to some of our partners for their advice and guidance with help on the recovery. And there's a few slides here which I think you may be interested in. Remember to claim R&D tax credits if you have not already claimed R&D tax credits, but have spent the money on research and development. You could be entitled to a tax rebate against corporation tax already paid. And also, if you have already claimed R&D tax relief, but are currently loss-making, you could be in line for a cash credit from HMRC. Also, you can apply for a cash advance secured against the expected R&D tax relief cash payments. More contact details on the bottom of the screen there for anyone who wants to get in touch directly with ABGI, who I'm sure are happy to discuss that further with you. Secondly, then, you can also take advantage of the low energy markets. So another of our partners are Energy and Carbon Management. I'm sure they will advise you on sort of the current market situations. Wholesale energy prices are making the news quite a lot at the moment, and a key tip from them is certainly to take advantage of the low energy market. And again, contact details on the screen there. Consider your people strategy. So Jonathan Lee, our Advantage partner and sector specialists, have a real grasp of the manufacturing market, and they can help you find the specialist skills, even if that's on an interim basis. It's also somewhere to direct staff who may need to help with CV writing and interview prep in the near future. And I understand there's no charge on consultations there for that work. Finally, as well, Westfield Health, another Advantage partner, offer a range of workplace well-being solutions, including an employee assistance line. And again, contact details for those are up on the screen now. And that's all from today's session. Thank you very much. Thank you.